The significance of the Sharpeville Massacre, 1960. Key question. How significant was the Sharpeville Massacre? The Pan-African Congress, PIC. The PIC was formed in 1958 by people dissatisfied by the integrationist approach of the ANC and also because many ANC members had been arrested. Robert Sobukwe was the most known leader of the PIC. He was born to unskilled laborers but became highly educated. He wrote for African journals like Beware and The Africanist, promoting African leadership, ideas, and protest. He led the movement opposing the ANC for its cooperation with other ethnic groups. The PIC philosophy. The PIC was opposed to communism and associated with movements for independence across Africa. They had a strong belief that Africans had to be responsible for their own destiny. The ANC felt the PIC's Africanist liberation views were inappropriate for the situation in South Africa because they were not fighting colonists and Africans were not all explicitly black. The PIC extremists argued there was no place for whites or Indians, but the ANC welcomed all supporters. The Sharpeville Massacre in 1960. Sharpeville was built in 1943 to replace the township of Topville. It was an industrial center home to 37,000 Africans, 40% of which were under 18. Authorities feared its expansion in proximity to white areas. There was a high unemployment rate and a crime rate, especially for the youths. There were not enough schools, so many turned to the factories. In 1959, a new police force was brought in. They were adamant about checking passes. Citizens resented these authorities and became radicalized. The Sharpeville Massacre in 1960 continued. The massacre was triggered when a drunk man fired a gun into the air and an officer stumbled. Other officers thought he was shot. Policemen fired volleys into the crowd, hitting demonstrators at the front and also people who were fleeing. 69 demonstrators were killed and 200 were injured. 70% of those had been shot in the back. Who was to blame? Police were on edge. There had been violence recently in the area. It was a long and hot demonstration. People were impatient and tense. The PIC leader Solo was arrested and couldn't control the crowd. Police wanted demonstrators to adjourn in a football field, but demonstrators feared it would become a mass shooting. The aftermath and responses to Sharpeville. There was an increase in demands for firearms by whites. Verwoerd was subject to an assassination attempt, and the new acting prime minister said change was needed for South Africa and the native question. Military wings of the ANC, the PIC, and other African resistance groups became more radicalized. Emigration rates began to exceed those of immigration. There were economic upsets, falling share prices, and a net outflow of currency. Aftermath and responses to Sharpeville continued. The Wessels Commission of Inquiry investigated Sharpeville, but it was accused of whitewashing, and the commission was reluctant to interview Africans. Sobukwe was imprisoned until May 1969. There was an international shock felt. The United Nations condemned apartheid. They then passed Security Council Resolution 134. South Africa made a withdrawal from the Commonwealth.
Key debate. How has the Sharpeville Massacre been interpreted? The Sharpeville after the massacre. 216 families and 500 children were directly impacted from the massacre. However, parents did not share the story with their children in order to protect them from politicalization. Father of Flynn held memorial services until he was deported in 1963, and his successors did not continue this tradition. It was not until the Black consciousness movement in the 1970s was the massacre formally remembered. Lodge said that the silence from the parents in the community helped increase militancy in the youth. Culpability of the police. Authorities viewed the event as a reason to keep Africans in check. The Wessels Commission report agreed with this. Right-wing groups supported this view, and a history of communism in South Africa portrayed the event as having large mobs of armed black people causing the cops to panic and open fire. Bishop Reeves and Ian Reid discredited this view through pictures and accounts from first-hand experience. Philip Frankel said terror and error due to poor leadership on both sides was what would cause the event. Government responses across the world. Other countries viewed the South African authorities as racist. The event helped push anti-apartheid movement across the world. Apartheid could no longer be justified, and the international community was shocked. This was not just limited to Sharpeville. The same day as Sharpeville massacre, thousands of demonstrators were demonstrating at Langa Flats bus station in Cape Town. Police charged the demonstrators with tear gas, batons, and guns, killing 3 demonstrators and injuring 27. In 1921, troops and police killed 189 supporters of a religious prophet. This was not the first time in Sharpeville that the police had killed protesters. It only showed how far removed South Africa was from the rest of the world.
Government policies of 1958 to 1964. What was the impact of the main government policies against opposition groups? Repression. In July 1961, John Vorster was appointed as the new Minister of Justice, and he created the Security Police. Then the Sabotage Act of 1962 created a death penalty for any type of acts of sabotage. The 1963 General Laws Amendment Act allowed authorities to arrest someone for 90 days without having to bring charges against them, and the Subukwe Clause was created so that authorities could keep people in prison beyond their sentence. Authorities also set up a network of spies and informers, and in 1963, a radio network of communication was created between 1,000 police stations. The Bantu Laws Amendment Act of 1964 was also created so that authorities could deport any African from an urban or white area. Impact of government repression. The security forces were able to do whatever they wanted, and in the 1960s, the defense budget and arms production dramatically increased. In 1960, conscription, or the compulsory membership of armed forces, was introduced for whites. Bantuistans. Verwoerd's government believed that Africans should live on tribal reserves. They claimed that this was fulfilling God's purpose. Bantustans were known as the African homelands, and this was South Africa's take on decolonization. Afrikaners suggested total separation of different races, so the African homelands was an example of this taking place. The Self-Government Act of 1958 allowed for the self-governing and financing for Bantuistans. Transkei. In 1963, Transkei was the first Bantustan created as a self-governing state. However, no other government recognized Transkei, and they never achieved any type of economic independence. This failed Bantustan policy led to the formation of militant opposition groups. Opposition to Apartheid 1960 to 1964. Why did opposition groups engage in an armed struggle? Nonviolent to violent protest. In June 1961, the creation of the Spear of Nation formed. This was an armed wing of the ANC. The PAC also created a militant group known as POCO. The government was arresting these opposition groups deviously. The ineffectiveness of nonviolent demonstrations. Peaceful protests were not working. For example, when the ANC protested by burning passbooks, the government took away benefits such as pensions, causing everyone to reapply for passbooks. Therefore, this form of protest was ineffective. The All in Africa Conference of 1961 threatened the government for an end of apartheid. However, the government ignored, also proving to be ineffective. Furthermore, the government banned opposition groups, therefore groups such as the ANC were made illegal. Increasing government violence. Rebellion led by the Intaba movement was defeated by the government forces. Defendants in the treason trial found it difficult to access lawyers during the 1960 state of emergency for defense. One of these people was Nelson Mandela. Violent protests 1961 to 1964. Mandela co-founded the military branch of the ANC. The initial intentions of this group was to commit acts of sabotage on government installations. It was supposed to be a war on the system, not the people. However, due to the ineffectiveness, the second phase involved guerrilla warfare. Umkhonto we Sizwe. This was also known as the Spear of the Nation, and it began in December 1961. Groups such as the CPSA, SACP, and SAIC also joined. They had strategy, training, finance, command for acts, as well as guerrilla warfare, working together to create an effective armed group. Government violence and failure to listen to the peaceful protest was the reason for this group's creation. This led to their armed violence, their bombings of government buildings, and this was followed by other 200 violent attacks. African Resistance Movement. This group consisted mainly of radical whites, and they conducted similar bombings in fight against apartheid. Most of the members were arrested for sabotage in 1964. POCO. This was the military wing of the PAC. This group was the most violent of the armed movement. They used methods of terror and intimidation on targeted whites. For example, they would kill any whites that got in their way of their movement and ideologies. This group was limited to Africans, however, to keep it pure. One of their attacks was the assault on Paarl, and a mob of 200 supporters attacked the police. This led to 2 fatalities.
Official responses to violent protest. How effectively did the authorities react to violent protest? After the treason trial, Nelson Mandela went underground. He drove as a chauffeur, worked on a farm, and had help from the Communist Party that was outlawed. In 1962, he traveled abroad and spoke in London international conferences. In August 1962, upon his return to South Africa, he was arrested and accused of incitement to strike and traveling abroad without a passport. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The Rivonia trial. In July 11, 1963, security forces raided the farm in which Nelson Mandela was working at. They found Spear of Nations documents, weapons, and 250 incriminating documents. October 1963, Mandela became the prime defendant in the trial, and most ANC and Spear of Nations leaders were defendants as well. Mandela spoke for 4 hours and admitted to the charges and justified the actions against apartheid. Evidence was overwhelming, and all the defendants received life in prison. The UN recalled for a release of all the defendants. Dock workers threatened not to handle South African goods. Some countries refused to trade with South Africa, and the US and USSR calls for clemency. There were multiple protests across the world over the defendants being committed to life. South Africa in 1964. How effectively was apartheid entrenched in 1964? State in 1960s. 1964. Most opposition group leaders were either exiled or in prison. The government control through legislation was extremely strong. Some examples are the Unlawful Organizations Act 1960, which made the PAC and NAC illegal. The Sabotage Act of 1962 called for the death penalty for sabotage and guilty until proven innocent. Bantu Laws Amendment Act was where authorities could deport any African from any urban or white farming area for any reason. Increased white immigrants and economic growth for whites. Verwoerd was assassinated in 1966, and the more oppressive John Worcester became the new president of South Africa. End of apartheid. Countries gained independence, such as Angola and Zimbabwe, and they became hostile towards South Africa and supported the opposition groups. In the 1970s, sanctions were imposed, Black consciousness movement and protests increased. In 1968, past laws were abolished. In 1980s, militant groups increased, and people called for the release of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela. ANC leaders were released in 1990. Mandela would help the National Party transition. Free elections took place in April 1994, in which the ANC won by 62.5% of the vote. Mandela became president until 1999. He died in 2013 at the age of 95 years old.